Hello and welcome. This is the Freedom Research Podcast, and my name is Anna Sarv. My guest today is Jessica Weinkle, an associate professor in the Department of Public and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Her research topics are broadly in the area of science, policy, and policies with current interests in examining issues of climate science and conflicts of interest relating to that. So, Jessica, it's really good to see you, and thank you for taking the time for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as we agreed on, we're going to discuss climate science or the current climate debate and what's going on there at the moment. So what would you say, Jessica? Well, if we look at the climate debate, how rational is it at the moment? What is your perspective on that?
How rational. I think that there are and have been a lot of different interests tacking on to climate change as an issue to advance whatever it is that they want to see in the world. And there are, at least as it's framed in like mainstream media, there has been a loss of rational sort of cause and effect discussions, especially if you look at disasters. That's being a big one, where at least mainstream, all of our primary argument is that the disasters are driven by climate change without fair consideration given to the way society is structured, historical inequalities, the fact that we are increasingly wealthy. And so it is, when these events occur, they are very expensive and they are very dramatic. They create a lot of footage and it becomes a valuable symbol to point at it and say, look at all this climate change, where that is not very helpful in driving attention towards energy discussions or driving functional policy for addressing disaster issues.
Yeah, how to respond to those disasters, for example, right?
Yes. So, yes, it's not very helpful in creating practical, cohesive policies and solutions that address the challenges that communities have when in the interaction between extreme weather and how it impacts their community. So pointing to climate change doesn't help that, because even if you were to, the problem is persistent with or without climate change.
Okay, so let me just follow up on that. We are being told that there are a lot more of those natural disasters occurring, correct? I mean, this is what we see. We have extreme weather events, as they say, and well, yes, there are heat waves, of course, but also they are saying that there are much more extreme weather events such as tornadoes and big storms and stuff like that, and also that these are related to climate change. So what I'm saying, are these, well, not directly then the result of our changing climate, or are they somehow, portrayed in the wrong way in the media?
Yeah, so there's two separate issues in that, right? So there's the geophysical event, right? Like the tornado, the hurricane, the precipitation. And then there's the social impact. The social impact, and you might measure social impact by cost, right? Say, how much has this event cost us? The social impact is driven by the way that we set up our societies. How many houses do we have in the way? How many cars do we have in the way? What's in those houses and cars? Lots of expensive electronics. How valuable is our currency, right? So one nation has, when we have, so in the United States, when we have a disaster, it's really, really expensive, big numbers. When other nations have their disasters, like when Hurricane, I think it was Maria, that came through the islands, those were devastating events, but they cost less. So attention is usually driven to those events that have really, really big numbers, which is a shame because disasters are not pleasant no matter who's experiencing them. Anyway, so with the geophysical events, what gets the idea that they're becoming more extreme, more frequent, more severe is in many cases a misnomer, right? So if you look at the IPCC reporting over time about these things, there are trends in the events, but the ability to pull out the trends in the events from general variability in the background, or sort of a natural variability or a climate variability in the background, is very difficult to do. So whatever the trend is in our disasters, our economic trends in the disasters, is separate from whatever sort of natural variability you might see in the extreme geophysical events.
Okay. So, I mean, I have understood or come to understand that I haven't read IPCC reports because, I'm just a simple person. I read other books, but there are thousands of pages of them, of course. And I've come to understand that they're not actually saying that most of these extreme weather events are, somehow there are more of them right now. And then they don't. The prognosis is also not that bad. They're saying that even in the year 2100, there are gonna be more heat waves, but probably most of these, what you can call an extreme weather event, there are not gonna be much more of them. So, would it be a fair characterization, or have I missed something here?
No, I think that's fair. There have been notable changes that they have attributed to climate change, anthropogenic climate change. There's been in some places, right? So it's like very nuanced stuff, right? So in some places, and I couldn't recite to you where, but in some regions there is a notable increase in precipitation. There is in some regions like the Western North America, there is notable, I think, increased aridity, like it's drier and hotter, right? So like these things lend to concerns about, let's say, wildfire and with precipitation with flood. But the connection there is complicated. So even if you have these like mild or marginal, I guess they would say, impacts on the extreme heat, the extreme dryness, the extreme precipitation, the connection between that and how we experience it, there's a whole social, institutional complex in there. So we experience, like California, for instance, in the United States, is hot and dry anyway. It is prone to wildfire anyway. And there's been a long history of, now that we look back on it, poor management of wildfires and forest land. And so now when we have fires, they're very, very bad, right? Like they're big, they're for all sorts of reasons about the policy choices that we've had in the past, including where we put our houses in relation to the forest. So we have those problems, again, with or without climate change. So climate change makes it perhaps a bit drier, perhaps a bit hotter there, because it makes it hotter, so it makes it drier. But the fires would be an issue even still. They're not necessarily more of an issue because of the overall warming. And the same thing goes with precipitation, right? So there's lots of reasons that communities flood based on how they manage their runoff, based on where they're located, how long it had been raining beforehand, before you had the actual flood, water, the soil saturation, all that stuff. There's all kinds of stuff that goes on in between. Some sort of marginal increase in precipitation and the actual flood. So in these more, I would say more like discrete events where you have like a hurricane, a tornado, or a series of tornadoes, those instances don't have the climate change signal, so to speak, that people have been popularly attributing to them.
Okay. But you pointed out also the costs of these things, these extreme weather events. And this is also something you have been researching and writing about. And as I understand, well, connected to, for example, insurance claims, the point being that you are making, and you probably already made as well, is that there are higher costs because of other problems, as you were saying, because, for example, inflation. Do I understand correctly?
Yeah, so inflation plays a part. If you don't adjust for inflation, you'll automatically get that increasing trend over time in disaster losses. And earlier I had misspoke. I had mentioned currency. I shouldn't have said that, but everything can be adjusted to whatever dollar or a unit of money that you want to use. But inflation is a better way of looking at it. So if you adjust disaster losses or economic losses from these events for changes in inflation over time, changes in population, and changes in wealth, the trend is minimized. There's like no trend afterwards. Oh. So the increasing trend that we see in disasters over time is a product of of there being not just more of us, but we're wealthier. The thing is that wealth also makes nations and states and individuals better equipped. It makes them more resilient, right? So in those that feel disasters and the most, those that have the hardest time being resilient, rebuilding, all of this stuff, tend to be less economically advantaged. I'm not quite sure what the proper term for that is these days, but they're poorer, right? Poorer nations, poorer states, poorer people. Mm-hmm. These disaster events are incredibly challenging for individuals, communities, and nations that don't have the wealth to deal with them. So the wealth itself, though it shows that it's very expensive, very difficult to deal with, is also an indication of the prosperity of the people. So and their ability to manage the events when they occur. So it's very, the dynamics in there can be, are complex, and the way that they are portrayed is incredibly misleading. Because what we hear is like, look at this huge event, it's so expensive, climate change, catastrophe, the awfulness, right? Mm. But it's actually like, look at the way the community is set up, look at how much money is there, look at how well the nation is able to handle and respond to this incredibly unfortunate experience, but they can manage it because of the wealth that they have. And I'm not saying that we cannot improve on our disasters. We can, we should. They are incredibly exposing of the inequities in society, and they're tragic. They're awful. So we should do something to improve the experience of these events for our most marginalized and vulnerable people. But the way it's generally portrayed is not, it's not even fair to those people that are most challenged by it.
Mm. Well, I mean, maybe we just have to tell ourselves that we can deal with the aftermath of such unfortunate events because, well, or we are being told the other way around. That's actually the case, that we are causing those events and more of those events, and that is the point. So what I'm trying to, form a question here is about, well, how it is still portrayed. Everything is portrayed. If you see a wildfire and, for example, last summer and already this summer, there were already some wildfires on the islands of the Mediterranean, and they're already again telling us that this is all very bad. It is really bad for the people there, etc. And at the same time, you hear, for example, Mr. Guterres from the United Nations telling us just recently or last week it did that we are on a highway to climate hell. Then it pretty much well, everyone can put together a picture that we are really bad for this planet. So what's your feeling, or how are you looking at those messages by these political figures?
How am I looking at it? It is a curious thing that the head of the UN is using this sort of language. I never really fully understood why unless he has, there must be some sort of political advantage to him to hang his hat on this narrative. I'm not quite sure what that is, what his brand career aspirations are. But it is a curious thing. So the way I look at it is when people latch onto that narrative, why? What's in it for them? Who are there? Tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. That sort of thing.
Yeah. So let's try to figure out then what's in it for, well, some people. If we can look at, we can always see, for example, when some scientists are talking about, or they're called climate deniers, they're always told to be, spokesperson for big oil, for example. But is it the other way around as well? Or I mean, there are big lobby groups for renewables, aren't there?
There are, and I think that that is fair, right? So like if you have crazy on one end, there's likely crazy on another end. They kind of breed next to one another. So I think that if there's an effort to classify somebody as not just a denier or whatever that is, but also as a part of this industry, it's a deflection. It's a non-engagement with whatever argument that they're making, that individual is trying to make. And I'm not saying that, like some people, or some arguments rather than the people, some arguments you can kind of roll your eyes and discredit. But a lot of it is of substance and needs to be engaged with. And the idea of just writing it off is, it shuts down a rational discourse. And that is dysfunctional. It's not good for democracy. It's not good for anything. It kind of puts everybody in echo chambers, starts to indicate that a certain level of propaganda is going on, and that sort of stuff.
But wouldn't you say that on, probably on several issues, but on climate issues or with the climate debate, we are kind of living in those echo chambers already, or how do you see it?
That we are already living in them?
Yep.
Yeah, sure. We are already living in them, and people are reinforcing them, right? So like the idea that you are this and I am that, you're on the bad team, I'm on the good team, is reinforcing that echo chamber, reinforcing whatever sort of polarization that people find to be an advantage, at least some people. And so the rest of us, you and I and whoever else that wants to engage in some sort of conversation, to come up with a conversation, a deliberation about what the problem is, what we should do about it, what is a pragmatic policy or idea that will actually address whatever the underlying cause of the issue is. That is imperative, not only for I don't know, free speech, democratic deliberation, but also just actual practical outcomes. Like if we have these problems, and what are they? Can we talk about them? And what are some what are ways to resolve them? That is the core function of government, is to address public problems.
Yeah, exactly. I absolutely agree, and the question here is that is there, well, there obviously are free speech issues in this climate debate, and there obviously are probably, well, maybe you can elaborate on that, problems with academic freedom even, or have you felt something like that there is somehow you cannot or your peers cannot say everything because they can be looked or put into one of those echo chambers and not taken seriously anymore, or something like that. Is there a problem with such things?
I am very fortunate in that I have not had a problem with it. So I have seen those problems play out for others. So I know that they exist, very much so. And yeah, they exist. But I don't know why I'm just fortuitous, right? So my position is in a regional university in North Carolina. And I'm in a political science department, right? So what was originally political science and now focused on policy. So the culture of our department is one of mixed ideas. So they're not necessarily picking sides in the technicalities of science. So a lot of my colleagues, they don't deal with science at all. They deal with public administration and the politics of Congress and that sort of stuff. So they're a lot more I wouldn't say tolerant, accepting, understanding of the ideas that you and I are talking about. And then as far as my position in the region, North Carolina is traditionally, it moves around a bit, but it was traditionally a very purple thing, represented by Democrats and Republicans. And then my county is, I think it votes, I think it comes out as voting Democrat in like a sea of Republican counties. But that being said, my experience living here is it's very mixed politically. And so there's just a lot more support for different ideas and tolerance for getting through the day in having different views of what the nation should be doing and what the problems are. So I've been fortunate in that I don't have that problem. I have seen those problems happen, and I know that I've had mild experience with it in graduate school where there was a way, and questioning the way was not necessarily even frowned upon, but an oddity. Like what is your what's wrong with your morals that you're not just following the way, right? But it was light and it was not too bad. And I thankfully ended up in a position that is not censoring. So, but I do know that these things exist. I've seen it happen.
Yeah. Of course, it is hard not to see. But another thing is that isn't the climate debate also a political thing in a sense? I mean, the more Republican you are, the more, I don't know. You don't want to hear about it and so on. In the United States, how is it over there?
How is it in the United States? I don't know. I don't want to say I don't know, but our leaders, I mean, now we're getting into like just my personal take, but my personal take is our leaders are equally nutty. But there is a far more even keel discussion, I think, about science today, at least, coming from the right or those that lean right, than what is coming from those that are on the left. But I think that wasn't necessarily always that way. It's just shifted. The younger generations are far more concerned, right and left. The younger people that, no matter what their political leanings are more concerned about climate change than the older generations. And so in appealing to those voters, both parties and both ideologies, I guess, have had to appeal to their concerns. So Republicans have become more open to it and have become more creative, I guess you could say, in how they address it. So there's been, in North Carolina, there was a pitch and they passed it. Republicans fought for having nuclear energy being categorized as clean energy. And that's significant because North Carolina is one of the top producing nuclear energy states. And that's not to say that it's so much that we produce, but we do rely on nuclear energy a lot. So rather than trying to kind of reinvent the wheel for North Carolina, why not just do that more? If we are concerned, if the state population is concerned about decarbonizing energy. So I would say that it's become more difficult to say, it's a Democrat issue, it's a Republican issue, because they've had to embrace the idea a bit more because of the younger generations, which is good. But they also they now have a more sensible discourse about the science.
Yeah. So, one thing I wanted to talk to you about, because you have written about it as well, is actually the younger generation. I mean, the climate anxiety. This is something that relates to young people here in Estonia as well. I mean, I teach journalism in a school, and my students are telling me that they're anxious about climate change. So when I talk to them, I ask them questions, what is the problem, etc. Then, well, it pretty much turns out that they are anxious because they are told so. They are told so in the media and so on. So that's basically the same thing. If you're giving the message that you are on the way to climate hell, then, I mean, I would be anxious. If I believed it, I would be anxious as well. So what about it? what drives the anxiety? What would you say?
Well, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I don't want to weigh in on like the psychological underpinnings of anxiety. But what I'm seeing is a couple different things. One is where should I start on this? One is let's start with just kind of where our conversation started with disasters. Because of the framing of our disaster events as a product of climate change, there is that anxiety that the anxiety that comes from that framing, right? These disasters are climate change. Look at what we've done to the earth. Look at what the older generations have done to the younger generations. They've created these disastrous events. And then that is reinforced by people in the climate psychology community with that linking. Because the events are traumatic, right? For some people, documented traumatic, it's been extrapolated out that climate change is traumatic. They're experiencing climate change through the disasters, which are traumatic. And then, so now it's like a cascade of trauma, right? Like that's being lumped up into climate change. And then you have, like you said, now you have major world political figures saying that there's like this hellscape going on. And for one that is just coming into, I don't know what's the word, like a political coming of age experience, right? And you have these major leaders saying these things. It is, I would imagine, anxiety provoking. So if you have the leader saying one thing and then the climate psychologist saying, oh yes, it's traumatic, look at this linkage between, disasters, climate change, trauma, then it makes sense, right? That they would be anxious. What's happening though, is that in the study of it, the explanation is then, if you're anxious about it, you should become more advocacy oriented. And so it's kind of, it's like breeding advocacy, like it's breeding advocates. And it's not fair because the younger people are genuinely concerned about climate change, and climate change impacts on the thing that they care about, let's say nature, if you want to say, or the environment, however you want to phrase it. And then they're also concerned about the disasters, which have a different cause thing. So these things are different, and they also, to the extent that they're learning about it on their phone and social media, and that's how a lot of them get their news. None of them really want to see the lights turned out, right? Like they need their electricity. So they need to be engaged in a more pragmatic, practical discussion about energy and how nations need energy, and you need energy, and how are we going to have this cheap energy to keep you plugged in while also addressing the other problems that you're concerned about. So there's also a mixture of interests in there, right? So one of the leading, one report that has garnered a lot of attention and gave a lot of attention to the climate anxiety train is a report by the American Psychological Association, which was created in partnership with Eco America, which is a large advocacy group that is geared towards, from what I can tell, it's geared towards a direct politicization of the healthcare field, right? So they have all sorts of opportunities to advance the climate change conversation in the clinician room. So like from what I can tell, based on the imagery that they provide, It's like while you're in your hospital gown and visiting with your general practitioner, they then hand you a QR code so that you can learn about climate change and become a registered voter. Like, it is just bizarre, like the linkages of the two. And then there has been, if you read through the report and at the end, it's like if your kid is involved, it has climate anxiety, you can get them involved in climate litigation. And so it's like a self-feeding beast. Like what does they call it? A self-licking ice cream cone. And it's a bit disturbing because not only do you have the broad public interest concern about energy and climate and disasters and all that, but they're young people that appear to be being, for my take, is they're being manipulated and they're being used in a very long game that's been going on for a long time on this stuff.
Okay. You have called also, you're saying that they're being manipulated, then the obvious question is manipulated by who? By whom? And you have said that something like a climate industry is also involved. I mean, I understand you're referring to some lobby groups that are behind the energy transition movement or something like that, or what is it? What is the climate industry?
So, two parts. The lobby group aspect was picked up by The Economist, I want to say a year or two ago, where they was saying, no, it was a couple of years ago, where they were saying that there is actually a substantial renewable, I guess you would say, energy lobby in DC that's been pushing for things like the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I didn't pull on those threads so much about the actual lobby, that piece of it, but there is another aspect of this lobby, and it's in how the interest in, I guess what I was talking about more is the climate intelligence, right? So what in the measuring of risks. What has happened there is that underpinning a lot of climate change science, or all of climate change science, are emission scenarios. And there's been a lot of controversy about those emission scenarios, not only in the extent to which they constrain the way that we understand the future, but in some of them, and the most prominent ones being incredibly implausible, misleading. It's just not an accurate depiction of our emissions future, given what we understand about the use of coal, the way that energy markets work, that sort of thing. So knowledge about energy markets has advanced enough to know that the theories that are underpinning those upper end emission scenarios or highest end emission scenarios are false. So there's reason to discard that high end outlook. There is a lot of business, though, that's been set up on these emission scenarios, and they work with the financial industry primarily, and that it originated really with working where climate science was working with the insurance industry, but with the advancement of seeking disclosures, I guess, in corporate filings, it's really blown up as far as who needs all of this risk analytics. And so underneath those risk analytics are these emission scenarios. And what company you go with depends on what emission scenario they prioritize and what their special sauce is. But I want to say all of them, but to be safe, I'll just say most of them are underpinning their work with the emission scenarios, which is holding those in place, and it holds certain assumptions in place. And you can see that in the United States with the The Biden administration a couple of years ago, out of their Office of Science and Technology Policy, came out with a report defending the upper end emissions scenario. So what's known as RCP 8.5 and SSP 5 8.5, total technical jargon there, but they defended that emission scenario. They defended the comparison of that scenario with another scenario, which is considered more of a plausible upper bound, right? So it's known in at least certain sectors of the science community that could be viewed as a more plausible upper bound, but the Biden administration framed it as more of a policy success story. So my point is, in trying to make this easier to listen to and understand, there is a business interest in maintaining the scenarios and maintaining a specific conception of climate change, of our climate change future. And it's an analytical industry. It's tied into the financial industry. And it is seems to be a thriving industry. But if you have that much, when you have the financial system, right, the global financial system, when you have central banks, when you have major insurance corporations, reinsurance corporations, when you have real estate entities starting to, or what govern those that are governing mortgages, when you have them relying on a certain construction generated by science or technical models rather, then that's a lot of weight on global climate change or the IPCC to hold on to those conceptions, because it's holding up this entire industry that has engaged itself with the financial structures, financial institutions of the world. So the IPCC was not built for that purpose, to undergird the financial system, right? It was built to provide science advice to nations and to help facilitate practical policy at the UN level. At this point, because you have a lot of people that are deeply embedded within the IPCC, also consulting with financially oriented groups, and because the IPCC work has become embedded within and as a legitimacy for this climate analytics industry, it's a lot of pressure to keep things the way that it is, to keep the narrative the way that it is, and that is a difficult nut to crack. But that's what I was writing about there.
Yeah. So yeah, it's. I mean, it sounds. It makes sense. I have to say, it makes sense if there are so much at stake financially, for example. Then you hold these things up, and this is also dragging down the discussion or honest discussion, probably, on these things and so on. So. I guess it makes sense, but now another issue, where it drives us is the same energy transition and the debate that where should our energy come from in the future. And as you also mentioned, this is also something that needs to be discussed, for example, with younger people, younger generation who are anxious about climate because. They get anxious using devices that need electricity. So if they want to have electricity, then they need to learn about these things as well. So what I'm trying to ask here is that what is the energy debate like in your view? Is it also, well, like I started, is it rational or is it emotional that you need to do these things because otherwise we're going to be doomed?
So I don't really have an opinion, I think, on what we ought to do. I don't know. I think I try to refrain from that sort of thing, the world according to Jessica Winkle, this is what we ought to do. But what has become apparent to me, and I'm not I don't know that I would say that I'm pro-nuclear. I'm not necessarily. But I have noticed the way that it gets cut out of debates, like it gets cut out of discussions altogether. So when I was looking at, the other day I was messing around with the Network for Greening the Financial System scenarios. And these are scenarios of the future that are being used by central banks for stress testing. And most of the world's central banks seem to be involved. But their ideal scenario, their net zero by 2050, has no nuclear in it. They intentionally see no nuclear production in the future. And whatever nuclear production is going on now, it will go away. So they have an ideal where the net zero future is sans nuclear, which is an interesting position for the world's central banks to take. It is an interesting political or policy preference to be embedded in the scenarios. And so I think that we use a lot of energy and people are going to use more energy. And so we need to consider the practicality of what we're talking about with trying to serve those energy needs through only wind and solar, it seems like, and how desirable that is. Like, what are the trade-offs there? So in California right now, again, I'm not in California, but one of the big debates is going on. They're planning a large solar farm that will, in order to do it, it will take out I think it's 1,000 plus, something like that, Joshua trees, which are these really cool, old, like several hundred years old desert trees, right? They're cactuses of some kind. They're cool. They're part of like a unique ecosystem. There's some animals that are adapted to them. But for the sake of climate change, they're going to remove them and put in a solar farm. And a lot of people think that's ludicrous. And yet there's a lot of fights about the retirement of some of their nuclear energy production plants. And so is it rational? I think it's driven by a lot of fear. It's driven, so I don't think it's a wholly rational, but more significantly, it's not wholly, comprehensive. It's not considering the full range of trade-offs between our environmental concerns and our energy needs. And it's not considering all the technologies that we have that we know are deployable, that we know are accessible, that we know that we can do. So it is misleading, I guess. It's probably more, I'm just going to say that. It's misleading.
Yeah. So, you mentioned nuclear as well. Nuclear power, if we talk about carbon dioxide, then it doesn't emit carbon dioxide. And this is also, well, in that sense, it is interesting that it is not loud. Okay, there are, of course, other problems related to nuclear energy. I'm also aware of that as well. But if we only talk about carbon dioxide, well, decarbonizing the electricity system is the main thing in this climate movement, I would say, and as you pointed out as well. So the question actually is how beneficial it is for humanity, for society, for economy, for climate, to fixate only on one molecule, on carbon dioxide. Even if I agree that carbon dioxide does drive climate change, it doesn't kind of make sense to center all our activities around this topic. Would you agree with that, or do you have a different perspective?
No, I think that what you're talking about is something I grapple with too quite a bit these days. Like what decarbonizing energy makes sense, right? It makes good sense. We're told the state of science is such that we understand that if we keep going along the way that we're going along, it presents risks, big risks, small risks. I don't know. I guess it's open for debate, but there are risks there. So if we want to not have those risks, then it would make sense to decarbonize. And there's other advantages to that, right? Like there's air quality advantages, there's job opportunity advantages, there's perhaps some energy independence advantages for nations if that's important to them. So there are many reasons why we might argue that, or we might consider that moving away from fossil fuel is a good idea. We might also say that maybe getting rid of it altogether is not a good idea or not something we want to do, or each nation can decide for themselves. The problem I think that for me, a greater concern is that what goes on more in urban spaces, like how are urban areas developing? How can we do that better? How can we perhaps reduce the impacts or reduce the creation and the impacts of the urban heat islands? How can we create our communities a little bit better? And the subdivisions have all sorts of problems with the way it diverts traffic, creates divisions in larger towns. I don't know. There's a larger discussion there. So I think focusing on the urban landscape is important and improving that. And I think it's important that no matter how individual nations or collectively we decide to address our energy needs, that it does not restrict the use of other nations from developing. I think that has come out as one of the larger concerns, in that we've been using climate change to say that this is such an urgent issue that now these least developed economies can't have fossil fuels to get to where they want to be, to get to the prosperity, resiliency, all the great things that other nations have accomplished on the backs of fossil fuels. Now we're telling them they can't do that. That's become a big issue in Africa. And I think that's just inappropriate. It's wrong. It's wrong. I mean, it's wrong to tell those nations that they can't do what they want to do for their people, barring, being harmful to other, like barring atrocities and stuff. Like you should be able to self-govern. Yeah. That's the whole idea of an independent nation is for yourself.
And maybe another thing is that those resources help with fossil fuels as well. They help you to cope with climate change because you have more opportunities to, do whatever you need to do to, for example, deal with the aftermath of a disastrous event, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it's wealth. I don't know if the fossil fuels itself make a nation more resilient, but it's the wealth that comes from having cheap energy.
Yeah, exactly.
And so anything that undermines that ability to develop, the ability to grow, will that necessarily undermine their ability to be resilient to these events. So yeah.
I mean, I totally agree that they need it maybe to build up their economy, but if you restrict them, then they're not going to be resilient, and they are not going to be, well, if there are going to be disasters, then they're not ready at all. So sadly, our time has run out for today. So it was really interesting talking to you and hearing those really important points that you made. I mean, there's a lot to think about here, and a lot of new information and fresh perspectives. So thank you, Jessica, for taking this time for the interview.
Thank you so much for having me here. I really enjoyed it.
Well, and for our audience, you can also check out Jessica Winkle's Substack, which is called Conflicted. And of course, for our fresh content, you can go to freedomresearch.org. So I hope you enjoyed it as well. So this is it from us for today. My name is Hannes Sarv, and this was the Freedom Research podcast. Thank you, and I will see you soon. Thanks.